Good evening, everyone. My name is David Elwood. I'm the dean here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I want to welcome you to what should prove to be, I think, one of the most memorable form events you've had a chance to be here. The events in Ferguson and Staten Island and so many other places are sometimes said to have awakened America to the great tragedy of unequal justice. Well, our guest has spent his whole life awake, brilliantly and courageously fighting the battles of individuals and sounding the alarm for the whole nation and the world. He fights for those on death row who are often young and black and forgotten and even despised. He fights to free the innocent. He fights for the humanity of all. He reminds us that each of us is more than the worst thing we have ever done. How loud are his deeds and words? At least 116 people who were on death row have had their sentences, has had some form of relief, whether it's being freed or their sentences reduced or something of that sort. And as of 3:15 this afternoon, his TED Talk, given on March 2012, had been viewed 2,165,633 times. As of 4:15 this afternoon, there were 120 more views. That's remarkable impact. It's my honor to welcome our speaker, Bryan Stevenson, back here to Harvard. He's a graduate of both the Kennedy School and the law school, and certainly someone we are immensely proud to be associated with. Today, he'll be speaking on justice in the era of mass imprisonment. Before I go on, I do want to thank the Institute of Politics, the Program in Criminal Justice, Policy and Management, located at the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, and my Chief of Staff, Sarah Wald, for all her work in putting this together. I also want to welcome President Drew Faust, who is here with us tonight, along with the Chief Counsel of the University, many other dignitaries, including members of my family. So it just shows you are as primo celebrity as we ever get here. Bryan Stevenson is the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative and has won national acclaim for his work challenging bias against the poor, people of color, in the criminal justice system. He's been representing capital defendants and death row prisoners in the Deep South since 1985, when he was a staff attorney with the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta, Georgia. His story begins, though, in rural Milton, Delaware, where desegregation was a bit slow to reach. His first classroom days were spent in a segregated elementary school. That was in the 1960s. This was a town where the doctors and the dentist's office, black children and their parents continued to enter through the back door while whites went in the front. His family, which was a strong and powerful force in his life, included his mother, Victoria Golden, his grandmother, Victoria Golden, who was the daughter of slaves in Virginia, and the family matriarch who taught him many valuable lessons about dignity, strength, and fighting for what's right, and perseverance. As a young man, his life was marked by great achievements. He excelled in school, played sports, and acted in plays. He went on to attend Eastern University and then came to Harvard in 1981. A turning point came when he traveled to Atlanta for a month-long internship in 1983 as part of a Harvard course on race and poverty. He worked for an organization known as the Southern Center for Human Rights. While Stevenson read transcripts that revealed the misconduct, and he reviewed briefs devoid of legal, he reviewed briefs that were rather devoid of legal analysis. Even as a student, he said, "I could do better." In both of the cases he worked on that January, the clients eventually had their death sentences set aside, and they received prison terms instead. It did seem to me that you could actually do something, he says. Since 1989, he's been the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, a private, nonprofit law organization he founded that focuses on social justice and human rights in the context of the criminal justice system. EJI litigates on behalf of condemned prisoners, juvenile offenders, people wrongly convicted or charged, poor people denied effective representation, and others whose trials are marked by racial bias or prosecutorial misconduct. In addition to all this, he's also been on the clinical faculty at NYU since law school since 1998, and in 2006, NYU presented him with its Distinguished Teaching Award. For his work, he's run an amazing number of awards, ranging from the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship Award, Reebok Human Rights Award, ACLU Medal of Liberty, Public Interest Lawyer of the Year, the Olof Palme Prize in Sweden, numerous honorary degrees, and the like. But there is one biographical fact that more strongly illustrates the character of our speaker than any other in my own mind. At age 16, his grandfather was killed in a robbery gone wrong. This is the man who fights for justice and mercy for those on death row. He has recently published a quite remarkable book called Just Mercy, with, by the way, a terrific title, which is a memoir that serves as a compelling analysis of how race and class distort our criminal justice system. If you care about justice, read that book. And if you really want to see a remarkable talk, watch his TED Talk. I'm sure we're in for a remarkable talk this evening. Please welcome Bryan Stevenson.
Thank you. What an honor for me to be back here at the Kennedy School. Many years ago, I was kind of roaming around these hallways looking for a path that might allow me to create some justice. And I want to talk a little bit about what I've learned since I was a student here that I think might be relevant to how we continue to find our voice in changing the world. And I want to just emphasize my conviction that people who come through the Kennedy School have enormous opportunities to really do justice, to create opportunities, to create more fairness, to create more opportunity, to change the world. And I believe that. It sounds sometimes like a slogan, but I believe it. I believe that we each have the capacity to change the world and to change it in ways that are profound and meaningful and important. But I'm often worried that our institutional experiences when we're students and when we're in places like this get complicated in ways that make us begin to doubt our capacity to change the world. Our role as teachers, those of us who teach, is to complicate the situations that you're trying to learn. We need you to understand all of the nuances and all of the details and all of the challenges and inconsistencies. And a lot of times when you start as a student, you have this grand ambition, and it gets so undermined by the complexity that you begin to think that your ambition is foolish and it's misguided. I see it happen to law students. And I really want to kind of talk about why you should not let that happen. The work that I do is on the criminal justice system, and in many ways, it's a problem we have developed in this country because too few people have had the hope and the ambition necessary, the courage and the leadership to do justice. This country is a radically different place today than it was 40 years ago. In 1972, we had 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, we have 2.3 million. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 6 million people on probation or parole. There are 68 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when they apply for a job, they're going to be disfavored because they may have to report that arrest history. The percentage of women being sent to prison has increased 640% in the last 20 years, and 70% of these women are mothers, single-parent mothers with minor children. So we're not just throwing these women into prison, we're condemning their children and their families. The statistic that bothers me the most is the statistic that just came out of the Bureau of Justice. The Bureau of Justice now reports that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. 1 in 3. That was not true. That was not true when you were born in the 20th century. That was not true in the 19th century. That became true in the 21st century. And there is this appalling silence in the face of that reality. You lose your right to vote in many states. Thousands of people came to Selma a few weeks ago. The president came, president of the United States and the president of the university. But too few people who came to Selma appreciated that right now in Selma, in Alabama, 31% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote. 31%. We're actually projecting that the level of disenfranchisement among African American men in some parts of the state of Alabama will be higher than it was at the time of the Voting Rights Act if we do not change. And this disconnect has created a lot of suffering and a lot of inequality. I go into communities where I sit down with young kids of color, 13 and 14-year-old children who tell me that they don't expect to be free or alive by the time they're 21. And that despair is utterly heartbreaking. So for me, it's become necessary to think about what are the elements of creating greater justice? What's necessary to create greater opportunity and fairness? And I want to talk about 4 things that I think are important. The first is that I am persuaded that if you're going to do good justice work, if you're going to be really good at creating policies that affect reform and help the most vulnerable, you've got to get proximate to the people you care about. You cannot, in my judgment, do good work, do good justice. You certainly can't change the world without spending some of your time in proximity to the things you care about. If you're interested in doing something about poverty, you've got to get close to the poor. You want to do something about the plight of kids and underperforming schools, you've got to spend some time in those schools. You're interested in criminal justice reform, you need to get inside the criminal justice system and see all of the nuances and details. Proximity is essential if you're going to make the kind of impact that I think you can make. It's also essential in that it will change you. As the dean mentioned, I'm a product of someone's proximity. I grew up in a community where black children could not go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. There was no high school for black children. When my dad went to high school, he couldn't go to high school in the county. But lawyers came into our community and they made that community respond to the requirements of Brown versus Board of Education. And but for their choice to be proximate, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you tonight. Proximity can change a lot. But our choice to get proximate isn't always easy. You're going to be taught, and there's a narrative out there screaming at you that if there's problems going on in that part of town, then you want to stay away from that. If there are systems that are not working very well for our most at-risk children, then you don't want to send your kids there. You don't want to be anywhere near that. If there are parts of our society that are failing and struggling, then you want to stay away. And I'm urging you to do the opposite. I think you should get close to the things that matter. Get close to the places where there's inequality and suffering. Get close to the spaces where people feel oppressed and burdened and abused, and see not only what it does to your capacity to make a difference, but see what it does to you. I think you'll see things and hear things and understand things that you didn't understand. My grandmother was this amazing person. She was the daughter of people who were enslaved. Her parents were born in Bowling Green, Virginia, in slavery. And she was born in Bowling Green, and she had this amazing quality about her. When I would see my grandmother as a little boy, she'd come up to me and she'd give me these hugs. And she'd squeeze me so tightly, I could barely breathe. And if I saw her an hour later, she'd come up to me and she'd say, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she'd assault me again. And if I said yes, she'd leave me alone. But she told me, you always have to get close to the things that matter. And she said, you matter to me, so you're going to stay real close to me. And I would go places, and she wouldn't let me get too far away. And she always had a hand on me. And there is something about proximity that I think grounds us in understanding who we are. Sometimes in school, we allow our education to make us distant from the things that motivated us to pursue the degrees we pursue. And I want to challenge you to not let that happen. Well, it's not just proximity. I believe the second thing we've got to do is we've got to change the narratives that sustain the problems that we see. The politics of fear and anger are behind mass incarceration. We have all of this over-incarceration and excessive punishment because we've allowed this narrative, this era of anger and fear to evolve. I look at complex problems all over the world, and I'm persuaded that behind these problems, the worst abuses, the worst oppression, there's always going to be some fear and anger crafted into a narrative that allows people to think it's okay to tolerate this kind of abuse. Even in our society, we've tolerated some things that I think there's going to be a time in our history where we're going to look back and say, why did we tolerate that? And the answer is going to be is because we allowed the narrative to become something crafted by fear and anger. At the bottom of genocide, at the bottom of oppression, at the bottom of abuse, at the bottom of exploitation and dictatorships, there is fear and anger. And our society has been infected by it. Everybody's competing to be tough on crime. We do these irrational things because we're afraid and because we're angry. And I believe that if we're going to create justice, we've got to change that narrative. I've been doing work trying to challenge the plight of children prosecuted as adults. The United States is the only country in the world that condemns children to die in prison, some as young as 13 and 14 years of age. We will not sign the Covenant on the Rights of the Child, the well-respected international document that protects the rights of all children, and we won't sign it because it prohibits the death penalty and life sentences for children. We've got some 250,000 kids who've been sentenced to prison for long term, for decades. 10,000 children in adult jails and prisons on any given day. 3,000 children condemned to die in prison. And there's a reason for that. There's a narrative out there. And this narrative was crafted by criminologists in the late 80s who went around saying that some children aren't children. And these people said that these kids, well, they're not really kids. They may look like kids, they may talk like kids, but don't be confused. These aren't kids. We've got some research, we've got some data, we've got some policy analysis, and we've determined that these children aren't children. We've determined that these kids are, quote, super predators. And we use that term to demonize a generation of children, mostly black and brown boys. And every state in the country responded. We lowered the minimum age for trying children as adults. We put tens of thousands of kids in the adult criminal justice system, and we created a system that has been, in my judgment, corrupted by a narrative that we cannot correct until we change the narrative. I represented a kid several years ago. He's a 14-year-old boy living in a house where his mother was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. This boy's mother had a boyfriend, and the mother's boyfriend would start drinking sometimes, and when he started drinking, he'd get violent. And one day he'd been drinking, and he came home, and he walked into the kitchen. He called the boy's mother into the kitchen. He didn't say anything to this woman. He just punched her in the face. She hit her head as she fell on the floor, and she was lying on the floor covered with blood. Little boy ran in to try to help his mom recover, and he tried to get her to wake up. He tried to get her to respond, and after 10 minutes, she wasn't responding. And this little boy thought his mom was dead. The man had gone into a bedroom and fallen asleep. She wasn't dead, but the boy thought his mom was dead. And he got up and he walked into the bedroom where the man was sleeping, and he walked over to a dresser drawer. And he opened the dresser drawer and he pulled out the man's handgun because he was just that angry. And he walked over to where the man was sleeping, and he stood there pointing the gun at the man's head while this man was snoring. And when the man stopped snoring, this little boy tragically pulled the trigger, and he shot the man in the head. He killed him instantly. Now, this child was about 5 feet tall. He weighed under 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. He was the kind of kid that had a chance of being tried as a juvenile, and he probably would have been tried as a juvenile, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, he was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. And the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they immediately placed him in an adult jail. Even today, we have 28 states where children are housed in adult jails and prisons. He'd been there for 3 days before his grandmother called me and asked me to get involved. And when she did, I went over to the jail to see this little boy, and I was astounded by how small he was, a little tiny kid. And I sat down, and he came into the room, and I started asking him questions, but he wouldn't respond to anything I asked him. And finally, I put my pen down. I said, "Look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me." He wouldn't say a word. I got up, I walked around the table. I didn't know what to do, and I sat down next to him. I said, "Come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. Come on, talk to me." And he kept staring at the wall, had this very vacant look on his face. Couldn't figure out what to do, and at some point, I just started leaning on him. I don't even know why, but I started leaning on this little boy, and I felt him lean back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him, and I said, "Come on, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me." And when I said that, this little boy started to cry. And through his tears, he began talking to me, not about what happened with his mom, not about what happened with the man, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night that he had been there, he'd been hurt by several men. He then told me on the next night he'd been raped by several people. He told me on the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been. And then I held this little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. I was trying to get him to calm down, and I couldn't. Eventually, I got him to calm down. I was going to go and try to make arrangements to get him out of that facility, and he was begging me not to leave. I said, "No, I'm going to be back." And I got out of that jail, and the question I asked myself is, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We've allowed a narrative to emerge that suggests that some children aren't children. I believe that all children are children. And when a society begins to demonize its kids and fail to recognize the vulnerability of all children, we are at risk of great abuse, great injustice. And we've allowed that to happen because the narrative has been allowed to persist, and we've got to change the narrative. I think it's cruel to say to any 13-year-old child that you are fit to only die in prison, and yet we do it. I think we need to change the narrative about race. I don't think we've ever really confronted the history of racial inequality in America. We've got a terrible, terrible problem in this country. We have all inherited the silence and the indifference of our parents and great-grandparents about this history of racial inequality. And it's left us vulnerable and at risk and colliding with one another. And I think we've got to make a decision to change that. I think we've now got to deal with this issue that we've allowed to be ignored for too long. But that means having difficult conversations and changing the narrative. At my project, the Equal Justice Initiative, we're actually talking about slavery. And we're talking about slavery because we don't think that we've ever had the conversation that we need to have in this country to recover from the legacy of slavery. I don't believe that the great evil of American slavery was involuntary labor. I think we've not really dealt with the hard issues of American slavery. The hard issues of American slavery can't really be evaluated until we think more critically about what the true evil of American slavery was. And slavery in America was very different than slavery in other countries. I don't believe that what we did was like what other countries did. People come up to me and they say, well, you know they had slaves in Africa. They did. You know they had slaves in Europe and Asia. They did. But those were societies with slavery. We became something else. We became a slave society. We actually created a narrative, an ideology to legitimate slavery. We didn't just want to own slaves. We didn't want to just own other human beings. We wanted to feel moral and just and Christian while we owned them. And so we created a narrative of racial difference to legitimate slavery. And that was the great evil of American slavery. This ideology of white supremacy, this notion that these black people were deficit, they were different, they weren't fully human, they weren't as smart, they weren't as hardworking, that narrative, that was the great evil of American slavery. And the 13th Amendment didn't do anything about that narrative. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't do anything about that narrative. And it's why I contend that American slavery didn't end in 1865, it just evolved. It turned into something else. It turned into decades of terrorism and segregation and racial hierarchy. We've just put out a report about terrorism, about lynching. And we call lynching in America terrorism because millions of African Americans were traumatized by the terror of lynching. We've never really talked about it. Older people come up to me sometimes and they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get so upset when I hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terrorism. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced our whole lives. And that narrative has to change. Even when we talk about civil rights, I'll be honest, I get worried. I think that we've become too celebratory when we talk and think about civil rights. You say the word civil rights and everybody just starts applauding, right? You know, it's like, I hear people talking about the civil rights movement like it's this 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, all these laws changed. And if that were our history, I mean, wow, we are an amazing society. But that's not our history. Our history is that for decades, we humiliated African Americans in this country. For decades, we injured and brutalized and marginalized and subordinated African Americans. We did destructive things that left devastating injuries. We traumatized and excluded people. And we've never talked about it. And because of that, we are still at risk. We're still vulnerable. You come to the Deep South, we love talking about mid-19th century history. We just don't like to talk about slavery. We've got 59 monuments and markers in Montgomery to the Confederacy. In my state of Alabama, Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday. Jefferson Davis's birthday is a state holiday. We don't even have Martin Luther King Day. We have Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. And this narrative has to change. The legacy of lynching, we don't talk about it. People think that all of the African Americans in Boston and Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and Los Angeles and Oakland kind of just moved into these communities as immigrants looking for economic opportunities, and they don't realize that in 1900, 90% of the African American population in this country was in the Deep South. And they fled by the millions during this era of lynching. And they came to Detroit and Cleveland and Chicago and Boston not as immigrants looking for opportunities, but as refugees from terror. And for those of you who've done international work, you know that when you're working with a refugee community, there are these special needs that have to be met if we're going to have success in that community long term. And we've never talked about it. I think the narrative has to change. You go to South Africa and they will tell you that without truth and reconciliation, there could not be progress. You go to Rwanda and people will tell you that there won't be progress without dealing with, telling the truth about the genocide. Even in Germany now, you're forced to deal with the legacy of the Holocaust. Go to Berlin and you are going to see the markers and the monuments and the stones where Jewish families were abducted and taken to the concentration camps. They want you to go to the camps and think soberly about the history of the Holocaust. We do the opposite in this country. You say the word race and everybody gets nervous and tense. We don't go and deal with these realities, and I think that narrative has to change. Third thing, I should have told you, these get harder as I go along. I'm sorry about that. Third thing, I believe that if we're going to change the world, if we're going to make a difference, if we're going to be people who come out of this institution with a vision that we can hold on to, we've got to protect our hope. And it may not sound very academic, but that's the thing that I worry about the most. I meet too many people who are hopeless about what we can do to end mass incarceration. I actually believe we can reduce the prison population in this country by 50% in the next 10 years without in any way threatening public safety. If we start dealing with drug dependency as a health issue rather than a crime issue, we're going to save a lot of families and create a lot of hope. If we start dealing with these things in a rational, sensible way, we can do it. But we've got to be hopeful about what we can do. I worry. I go into court sometimes, I see a hopeless prosecutor, I see a hopeless judge, I see a hopeless defense attorney, I see a hopeless client, and I know there's going to be injustice in that courtroom. Hope is essential. Even as you're a student in a school like the Kennedy School or at Harvard, you've got to protect your hope because things will complicate life in a way that makes you begin to think that you can't do the grand things that made you want to come here, and you've got to fight against it. We need people who are prepared to believe things they haven't seen to create a new world, a just world, a better world, and your hope is critical. Now, I'll tell you that some things that threaten my hope may not threaten your hope, but they are the things that we've got to work on. We've got to be attentive to. Sometimes when you know what makes you hopeless, you can prepare yourself to deal with that. And I'll tell you what makes me hopeless. I live in Alabama. It's probably the worst place on the planet for me to be living because I don't like it when I see these Confederate flags. I don't like it when people start talking about the good old days. I don't like the romanticizing of the old South. I don't. It bothers me. And I'm easily provoked by it. And I'm challenged by it. I was going to a prison not too long ago, and there was a truck out in this prison parking lot, and this truck was like a shrine to the old South. It was covered with all of these Confederate flags. It had the gun rack. It had all these bumper stickers. There was a bumper sticker on this truck I'd actually never seen before. One of the bumper stickers read, quote, "If I'd known it was going to be like this, I'd have picked my own cotton." Hadn't seen that one before. I was really agitated by it, and I went into the prison to just try to get to see my client, and there was a white guard standing at the door, and I walked up to this man. I said, "Hi, I'm here for a legal visit. My name is Bryan Stevenson." And the man immediately said to me, he said, "You're not a lawyer." I said, "Oh, yes, sir, I am. I've been to this prison before." He said, "I don't believe you're a lawyer." I said, "No, sir, I'm an attorney. I've been here before." And he said, "Where's your bar card?" I said, "My bar card is in the car, but I've never needed my bar card before." He said, "Well, you're coming into my prison. You're going to have to go get your bar card." He made me go back to my car and get my bar card. I brought it back to the prison door. I was insulted. I showed it to him. I said, "Look, I want to see my client now." And he looked at it and he says, "Okay, well, you're going to have to get in the bathroom. I'm going to have to give you a strip search." I said, "No, sir. Lawyers don't get strip search coming into this prison. You're coming into my prison, you're going to get in that bathroom, and I'm going to give you a strip search." I had to really think about it. Couldn't figure out what to do. Couldn't get anybody to help me. Had driven 3 hours to be at the prison, and so I made the very difficult choice to go into the bathroom and allow this man to subject me to a humiliating strip search. I came back out, was trying to recover some dignity, and I looked at the man and said, "Look, I want to see my client now." And he said, "Well, you've got to go back there and sign the book." I said, "Lawyers don't have to sign that book. You're coming into my prison, you're going to go back there and sign that book." So I did. So agitated. And finally, he took me to the door, and he unlocked the door so I could go into the visitation room to meet my client. As I stepped through the door, he grabbed me by the arm, and he said, wait, let me ask you something." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Did you see that truck out there with all those bumper stickers and flags?" I said, "Yeah, I saw that truck." He said, "I want you to know that that's my truck." Really provoked me, really provoked me. I was sitting in the room just agitated, waiting for my client to come out. The client was somebody I'd never met before, a young African-American man, and he came into the visitation room, and he sat down, and the first thing he said to me was, quote, "Did you bring me a chocolate milkshake?" And I thought to myself, this is the strangest day I've had in a really long time. I said, "No, I didn't bring you a chocolate milkshake. I'm your lawyer. I'm here to defend you. I've got some questions." And I started asking my questions, and he wasn't paying attention. And I realized he was still hung up on this milkshake. So I put my pen down. I said, look, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you wanted me to bring you a chocolate milkshake. The next time I come, if they let me, I'll bring you a chocolate milkshake. And this man smiled and smiled and smiled. Terribly disabled person, terribly disabled. Horribly abused as a child. He was in 29 foster homes by the time he was 10 years old. At the age of 13, he began showing symptoms of bipolar disorder, but he couldn't get medical care because he was poor, so he started using crack cocaine. By the age of 15, he was addicted to heroin. At the age of 16, he was homeless, began showing symptoms of schizophrenia. By the age of 18, he was having psychotic episodes. At 19, when he was homeless and drug addicted, in the midst of a psychotic episode, he committed a brutal crime where he stabbed someone to death. He was immediately arrested, charged with capital murder, quickly convicted, and sentenced to death. The trial lasted a day and a half. I got the record, and I read through the record, and I couldn't find anywhere in the record the words mental health, mental illness, mental disease, mental disability. Terribly defended. And one of the great challenges we face in this country is that we've got a criminal justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. We decided to work on this case. We got our experts involved. We got some great experts to start working on the case, and much to my delight, they put together a really powerful case for his disability. And we went to court, and I was hopeful. We got some foster parents who were going to testify, and I was feeling hopeful about the case. And when I got to the courtroom, I was shocked to see the guard that I hadn't seen since that first encounter sitting in the courtroom. He was the person who had brought my client to the courthouse. And I went over to my client. I had to go through the ritual. I said, I'm sorry I couldn't bring you a milkshake before I could get him to pay attention. And then we started doing the hearing. And we had a really good 3 days in court. The experts were great. The judge was paying attention. I was growing hopeful about the outcome. The witnesses testified very well. And after the hearing was over, I decided to go see my client one more time. And I drove down to the prison, and I parked my car. And I'm walking to the prison door, and lo and behold, what do I see in the parking lot but that truck? And I thought to myself, oh God, I'm going to have to deal with this guy today. I don't feel like it. And even though I'd driven 3 hours, I said, you know, I'm just going to come back another time. And I turned around to go back to my car, and I was about to go back and just come back another time when I started remembering that song they used to sing when we were in the civil rights movement in the early days. They used to sing a song, and they said, can't let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. I started hearing that song, and I thought to myself, I can't just walk away. I got to go deal with this. And I got my bar card, and I decided to just go deal with this guy. And sure enough, standing at the front of the door was that guard, and I walked up to him and said, hi, I'm here for a legal visit. Here's my bar card. And the man immediately said, hello, Mr. Stevenson, how are you? Kind of threw me. I said, I'm fine. I said, I'll go in the bathroom and get ready for your search. He said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, we're not going to do that today. I said, well, thank you. I said, I'll go over here and sign the book. He said, Mr. Stevenson, I saw you coming, and I signed you in. Really threw me. I said, well, thank you. He said, yes, sir. And he took me over to the door to go into the prison. And I was trying to figure out what was going on. And when we got in front of the door, I stood and watched this man try to unlock the door, but all of a sudden his hand started shaking so badly he couldn't get the key in the lock. And I was standing there watching while his hands were shaking, and he couldn't get the key in the lock. And eventually he got the key in, and he unlocked the door. And when he looked up at me, his face was red, and I thought he was about to cry. And he said, Mr. Stevenson, I have to say something to you. I said, what's that? He said, well, I just want you to know that I was in that courtroom and I was listening. He said, I want to tell you that I came up in the foster care system too. He said, I didn't think anybody had it as bad as I did, but I realized that maybe your client had it worse than I did. He said, I'm a really angry person, been angry my whole life. He said, but I want to tell you something. He says, I think what you're doing is a good thing. And then he looked at me and he says, I hope you keep fighting for justice. Would have never predicted it, would have never guessed it. He put his hand out and said, sir, can I please shake your hand? And I shook his hand. I said, look, I can't tell you what this means to me. Thank you. I was about to go inside the prison, and I was taking a step, and he grabbed me by the arm. He said, wait, I got to tell you something else. I said, what's that? He said, well, I just want you to know I did something on the way back from the courthouse to the prison. What'd you do? Well, I decided to take an exit, and I took your client to a Wendy's, and I bought him a chocolate milkshake. It's a really silly story, but it speaks to me about the importance of staying hopeful about what we can do. Your hope is essential. I believe to change the world, sometimes you've got to stand when everybody else is sitting. Sometimes you've got to speak when everybody else is quiet. And it's your hope that will get you out of your seat. It's your hope that will allow you to find your voice. And when you hear people saying, these people can't do that, and these people can't do that, and that can't happen, and this can't happen, what are you talking about? Reduce the prison population by 50% in 10 years. That can't happen. We need your hope to respond and say, it can, if we do what must be done. Fourth and finally, and this is a hard one, I don't think we can change the world. I don't think we can create greater justice just by being proximate, just by changing the narrative, just by holding on to our hope. The fourth thing I think we've got to do is that we've got to choose to do uncomfortable things. And I hate saying that, but it's true. I don't think we can create justice in this country. We can't create justice in the world. We can't create peace and understanding by only doing what's comfortable and convenient. When I read history, I see that the moments when we've had great progress have been moments defined by the people and the places and the times when we chose to do something uncomfortable. And it's hard. It's very hard because we are programmed to do what's comfortable. Human beings are just designed that way. We go to the places that are comfortable. We do the things that feel comfortable. We stay with the people that make us comfortable. We love comfort. And I'm not against comfort. Don't get me wrong. I love comfort. I'm not against comfort. I was giving a talk down in Mississippi. I got off the plane, and people came up to me, and they said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We know what kind of person you are. And we've read all about you. And we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. We asked one of the farmers if they would put you up in the barn. And I looked at them and said, what is wrong with you? I said, of course I want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And, I like those chocolate chip cookies just like everybody else. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that sometimes you have to choose to do something uncomfortable because it is necessary to create justice. The civil rights movement was populated by people who chose to do uncomfortable things. And it's necessary that you appreciate that there's power when we sometimes do the uncomfortable. I was giving a talk in a church, and an older man was sitting in the back of the church, and this man taught me something. He taught me that there's a different metric system for those people who choose to get proximate, that choose to change narratives, that choose to be hopeful, that choose to do uncomfortable things. And there are metrics that we have in universities. There are grades, there's money, there's prestige, there are all these things. When you come out of the Kennedy School, there are all these things that we'll pay attention to, and we can and we should. But there's another metric system I want you to consider. And it's rooted in your commitment to do the difficult things, to do uncomfortable things, to stay hopeful, to change narratives and be proximate. This older man was sitting in the back of the church as I was giving this talk. He was in a wheelchair. And he was staring at me the whole time I was talking with this very angry looked very stern. And he was sort of distracting me because I couldn't figure out what was the problem. And he kept looking at me so hard. And I kept going through my talk. And when I finished the talk, people were nice. They came up. And this man kept sitting in the back staring. And eventually everybody left. And this man had a little boy wheel him up to me in the front of the church. And he came down the aisle with this very stern look on his face. And he got in front of me. And he put his finger up. And he said, do you know what you're doing? And I didn't know how to respond. And he asked me again, he said, do you know what you're doing? And I stood back and I started mumbling something. I don't even remember what I said. And then he asked me one last time, he said, do you know what you're doing? And I stood there staring. He says, I'm going to tell you what you're doing. And then this older man looked at me and he says, you're beating the drum for justice. And I was so moved. He says, you're beating the drum for justice. He said, you keep beating the drum for justice. And I was really moved. And then the man said, come here, come here, come here. And he grabbed me by my jacket and he pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, I'm going to show you something. And this man looked at me and he turned his head. He said, you see this scar I have behind my right ear? He said, I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama in 1963. He turned his head and said, you see this cut I have down here? You see that scar? He said, I got that scar in Philadelphia, Mississippi during Freedom Summer. And then he turned his head. He said, you see my dark spot? He said, that's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham during the Children's Crusade. He said, I'm going to tell you something. He said, people look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars. He said, but I'm going to tell you something, young man. He said, these aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars. He said, these are my medals of honor. There is something honorable when we recognize that we can do difficult things in service of justice. I believe really simple things. I believe that each person is more than the worst thing they've ever done. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody steals something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a thief. I also believe that we talk too much about wealth in this country. I hear it all the time, money over here, money over there. I am not against wealth. I believe we've got to have money and good distribution of wealth. But I don't believe the opposite of poverty is wealth. I don't. I'm persuaded that in this country, The opposite of poverty isn't wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And we need to talk more about justice. We need to create just relationships. We need to do the things that facilitate justice. And finally, I believe, in our public policy analysis, when we're evaluating what's a success, when we're evaluating what's good, when we're evaluating what's working, I'm going to urge us to not judge our success by how we treat the rich and the powerful and privileged. I believe you judge the character of a society, the effectiveness of a policy, the commitment to the rule of law, the civility of a community, not by how it treats the rich and the powerful and the privileged, but by how it treats the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. There is a great opportunity at this point in our history when there is so much insecurity, so much misunderstanding, so much distrust. And we just need more people to get proximate, to change narratives, to do hopeful things, and yes, to do uncomfortable things. This is a space that has been occupied by people who have made legendary contributions to our world because they chose to do uncomfortable things. I hope it's a space that you'll contribute to when you leave this room, as you go through your careers, as you go through your degree programs. I'm so excited to be back at the Kennedy School. I have so many wonderful memories of my time here. But what I most want to honor are those of you who have come into this room looking to find your way to stand when others are sitting and speak when others are quiet. I am so grateful and thankful to you for this opportunity. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Told you it'd be great. So we have time for questions. I just want to remind all of you, a good question at the Kennedy School consists of three things. First, I'd like you to identify yourself. Second, keep it short. And third, have it end with a question mark. There are microphones here and another one here, here, and here. So I guess I'll start. I have a question for you to begin with. We've seen this extraordinary, you described the last 40 years in a way that was quite frightening. This last year, we've seen something different. There was a fear, I think, on some people's part that Ferguson would be a 3-day story or whatever else. It feels like something's different. Do you think it is, and where do you now think the next lever, the next hope, the next narrative can come from?
Yeah. No, I think it is different only because there is this growing space for leaders to lead. I mean, I think the opportunity to lead, Ferguson is not the first incident we've had in the last 40 years. You go every year and there is this kind of tragedy that disrupts a community. In Los Angeles in 1992, we had real catastrophe around the same kind of problem, but we didn't have leadership to turn that problem as an opportunity to move forward. And I think there's a little bit. I credit the president for creating this task force on policing to create a conversation around that.
And you're a member of that.
I am a member of it, yes. So that's primarily why I'm crediting him. But no, I'm not. No, but I do think that people are perhaps feeling like it's time to stop talking about being tough on crime. And you hear it from both sides. People are saying, no, let's be smart on crime, right on crime. And I do think there's enough of an understanding, finally, that there's a resistance to just doing what we've done. I wrote this book because I'm persuaded that if most Americans saw what I saw what I see on a regular basis, they would demand reform. And we just needed leadership to push that forward. Even the court, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, the court was contributing to excessive punishment by upholding these extreme sentences. Life without parole for a first-time offender because of drug possession. The court said that's constitutional. I think the court today would say it's unconstitutional, because they recognize the cruelty and the lack of regulation. But I also think that our understanding of these problems has to continue to focus on these dynamics that I was talking about. Because if we're not careful, this moment will pass. I look at Ferguson and things like that, and for me, that issue isn't just about policing. It isn't just about race. It's about the presumption of dangerousness and guilt that gets assigned to people of color. And there are black and brown people all over this country that are presumed dangerous and guilty. And I told the law students this earlier, don't think that coming out of Harvard University or having a degree from the Kennedy School will insulate you from being presumed dangerous and guilty if you're a person of color. It will continue. And we've got to change it. I was telling people earlier, I was in a courtroom just in the Midwest a couple of years ago doing a hearing. And I got to court, I had my suit on, I had my shirt on, I had my tie on, I was at the counsel table there early, ready to do my thing. And the judge walked in and he saw me sitting at counsel table and he said, hey, you get out of here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. You get back out there in the hallway and wait until your lawyer gets here. And I stood up and I said, oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson, I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing, and the prosecutor started laughing, and I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. And then my client came in, a young white kid I was representing at this hearing, and we did the hearing, but afterward I was thinking to myself, what is it that when this judge sees a middle-aged black man in a suit and tie at counsel table, it doesn't occur to him that that's the lawyer? And then I thought, well, whatever it is it going to disadvantage defendants of color when they're sentenced? And I think it is. Is it going to change the way that judge hears the testimony of African-American witnesses? Yes, I think it will. Is it going to change the way that judge values the victimization of people of color in that community? Yes, and we've got to change that. Just in the same way, it's a different kind of violence. It's a different kind of shooting. It's a different kind of crisis. And so all of that has to be wrapped together. So I do think we're in a moment, but it's a moment that has to be sustained by a deeper engagement with these issues. But I'm hopeful that we can achieve that.
Right over here.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Leah Singer, and I'm a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee. My question for you is that today I heard about a success you had on a case, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And I was wondering if you could speak to that accomplishment a little bit.
Sure. Yes, I've been really edgy all day, and I chose not to talk about it tonight because I thought I might just dissolve into weeping or something like that, which wouldn't be good. Oh, okay. No. No, it's okay. I'm feeling better. No, it's a wonderful, wonderful development. But yes, I have been representing somebody who's been on death row for 30 years, who is innocent. And we were able to uncover evidence of his innocence that was, in my judgment, absolutely irrefutable. It was a firearm case where they said that this man committed these murders in Birmingham because a gun found in his home had been matched to bullets from these 3 crimes. And he was so poor at the time of his trial that he couldn't get the kind of expert he needed to prove that that wasn't true. He actually had to his lawyer hired a civil engineer who was literally blind in one eye and could not use a dual lens microscope to actually look at the evidence. And the guy was laughed out of the courtroom when he was convicted and sentenced to death. And this man has spent the last 30 years in solitary confinement on Alabama's death row. He's been down the hall when 51 people have been executed, the first 30 of whom were executed in the electric chair, and he would talk about smelling the flesh burning in his cell. And he's been threatened with death every day by the state for something he did not do. And when we presented the evidence of his innocence, we got the 3 best gun experts in America to test this weapon, and they all quickly, unanimously said, no way is this weapon involved in this crime. And I thought then we would see some justice, but they absolutely would not do anything. They never said, we don't believe you. They never said, we discredit this. We never said, we don't believe these experts. They just said, we're not going to do anything. And another 15 years went by. And we've got turned around by every court. Every court said no. Every court said no. And I finally got the United States Supreme Court last February to overturn the case and push it back to a new trial. Then I thought, well, finally, we're going to get him out. And the state said no. We're going to try to convict him again. And it's been one thing after the other. They said they lost the evidence, and then they found the evidence, and finally I got the court to order them to test the evidence. And late last night, I got a notice, a call, telling me that the evidence results came back confirming what we've been saying all along. And early this morning, the state called and finally conceded that they had the wrong person. And tomorrow morning, this man is going to be released from prison after 30 years. Yeah. Thank you. It's very gratifying, and my client and I have been having these really emotional conversations all day, and it's so exciting. We've been trying so hard to get to this place, and it is a triumph, but it is also a tragedy. because they took something from him that they can't get back. And last night the conversation was, oh, I'm so happy, this is what I've been waiting for, this is what I'm looking for. And he was been so anxious about whether he would ever get out of prison and avoid execution. That's what we've always talked about. And then this morning when we were talking on the phone, what he was anxious about was the world in front of him. He said, I don't know anything about the internet. I don't know anything about the ATM. I don't know anything about these smartphones. And now I'm anxious about what's on the other side. And he said to me, will I ever be able to live a life without this kind of anxiety? And I asked him, I said, well, what do you want? And we were talking. He says, well, what do you want? He says, it's so embarrassing. And he started crying because he felt so bad. He says, all I want is freedom. And when I start trying to think of the other things I want, I can't think of a single thing that I want as much as freedom that's worth mentioning. And I feel like I'm somehow incomplete because I can't tell you what else I want. And all of that disruption that is created by what we've done, that's the tragedy part. But we're going to embrace the triumph part with a lot of love and a lot of excitement. It's a microcosm of all that's wrong with our case. It was about race, it was about poverty, it was about indifference, it was about our unwillingness to own up to our mistakes. But I'm super, super happy. I'm going to remember this trip to the Kennedy School, to Harvard, not only because you've made it special by being here, but I'm going to remember it because it was the day when we finally won this long-term battle to resurrect a little justice for someone. Yeah.
Right up here.
Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Ray Fong. I'm a Harvard alumni. I am certainly moved by your eloquent discussion for the call for justice for criminals, or in this particular example, for the call for justice for people falsely accused of crime. My question to you is, how should we balance that call for justice for criminals against the call for justice for victims of crime?
Yeah. Well, I don't think of the world in that kind of dual way. I mean, if somebody asked me, where can I find the most victims of crime and violence? Where can I find the largest aggregation of people who have been abused or neglected or raped or robbed or had family members murdered? If I was going to answer that question, I'd say it would be in jails and prisons. Because the families and the communities where my clients come from are families and communities that are experiencing victimization at rates 3 times greater than the rest of society. And so for me, the question isn't how do we deal with this group and that group, it's how do we deal with people who are being threatened and menaced, who are being victimized in different ways. I absolutely want to create less victimization. There's nothing that bothers. I was telling the group upstairs that I hate violence. I hate all of these things. I want us to do the things that actually end violence. But what we've been doing is actually saying, no, after you've been violated, after you've been raped, after you've been murdered, we're going to beat up on the person that's committed that crime. And then we ask ourselves, well, how do we balance it? Well, we balance it by saying, let's create a world where there's less violence. But that means intervening on the lives of people who are at risk. I was talking last night, we've got children in this country who are born into violent families. They live in violent neighborhoods. They go to violent schools. They're chased by violent gangs. And there's a point in their life where they're going to react violently to the stress of all of this. Now, are they a victim or are they a criminal? They are both. And I want to do something that actually addresses both parts of this, because we won't get to balance. We won't get to justice until we do that. My racial justice work is about actually victims' rights. That's what that work is about. My work on behalf of children is about victims' rights. My work on behalf of people wrongly convicted is about victims' rights. But it's also about not reducing people to their worst act. As much as I'm antagonized by these prosecutors who have done really incompetent and unethical things, I want them to do better. I don't want to just condemn them. I want them to do better. That's what I want. And I want that for everybody. As was indicated, my grandfather was murdered when I was 16. Devastating, devastating. But the question we were asking is why? We weren't asking who and what can we do to them. The question we were asking is why? And I want to answer that question in a way that means that maybe somebody doesn't lose their grandfather next year or the year after that. And there are a lot of things that we need to be talking about if we're going to do something about victims, including guns, including the way we deal with drug and alcohol addiction, including the way we manage and provide services to the most at risk. But we somehow isolate that from this conversation. We only talk about punishment over here and victims' rights over there. And I'm worried about that because I think it's a construct that ultimately doesn't succeed. So yes, I'm deeply, deeply committed. I spend a lot of time with the family members of the people who are violated, even by some of my clients. And nothing creates more hope for me when I see some restoration, some responsiveness to that victimization that makes people feel a little less oppressed and burdened by what's happened to them.
Think right up here.
Thanks. My name is Jamarcus. So I'm from Arkansas, where a lot of, I would say, archaic ideologies associated with mass incarceration are like very deeply ingrained within my state. And so I'm guessing, I'm wondering, what advice would you give in order to establish more hope and compassion on the statewide level when individuals don't really have that experience that the Guard was able to gain from an individual perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that we have to get people to think about these issues in a different way. We're making some progress in some of these states. You have to take all the tools, including things like cost, right? In the South we have some struggling economies, and we have spent millions of dollars. We spent $6 billion on jails and prisons in 1980, and we spent $80 billion last year. And we've actually bankrupted our schools and our health and human services and our public services because we've invested in jails and prisons. And sometimes you get their attention by saying you can't afford all of this over-incarceration. I've got a client who's serving life without parole for writing a bad check for $100. And I ask every politician, who can defend this? And they can't. It's a habitual felony offender in one of these 3 strikes cases. So sometimes we get their attention that way. The other way we do it is by kind of challenging them to create a new narrative. I was telling the group earlier, this is my fantasy. I am persuaded that there's going to be a southern white governor at some point, I hope, who I can go and see and say, you know what, I want you to end the death penalty in your state, maybe in Arkansas. And I want you to end the death penalty not because you're morally opposed to it, not because you think it's unreliable, not because you think it's unfair, not because of cost. I'm going to say to that governor, I want you to say you're going to end the death penalty because our history of racial inequality and lynching and violence and slavery means that we should not engage in killing other people. Right. And we're going to do it just to kind of honor and reflect that thing. The death penalty for me is not about whether people deserve to die for the crimes they've committed. The death penalty for me is, do we deserve to kill? And when you have a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent, when you have a system corrupted by these presumptions of dangerousness and guilt and race and politics and all of that, you don't deserve to kill. And I want that governor to say, you know what, I'm not going to have the death penalty in my state because of our history of racial inequality. Right. And I'm going to say, watch what happens. Every state in the country is going to know your name. Countries all over the world are going to be talking about what you do because what you will be doing is leading us on a new narrative. And I think that's the kind of conversation we need to start having with some of these folks. Wouldn't cost you anything. It wouldn't kind of be a big deal, really, in the sense of all the things that are happening, but it would be remarkable. And that's what I want to facilitate in some of the conversations we have in the South. Yeah.
Right over here.
Hi, Bryan. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for being here. My name's Caroline. I'm from South Carolina. And I am an MBA at MIT and an MPA student here at the Kennedy School. I'm graduating in May and going back to South Carolina.
Wonderful.
Because I want to be proximate.
Yeah.
In my journey, otherwise known as a job search, I am running up against something you mentioned, which is that we Southerners are very polite, but we are very uncomfortable with uncomfortable topics. And I'm just wondering if you'd speak a bit about the early days and where the wedge is, that where you can begin those conversations, because people don't want to talk about inequality, especially among racial lines.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great question. I think you do have to be tactical and strategic. We've got some tools that we're using to change the narrative. If you go to our website, you're welcome to kind of ask for any of these things. But we've put together a calendar. It's one of these little subtle things that we do, and it's a calendar that just documents the history of racial inequality. It's not a very cheerful calendar. It's got some difficult, we don't have Barack Obama's birthday in it. We don't have all of these celebratory things. It's about these moments in history when there are difficult things have happened. But I've gotten the most inspiring calls from people who said, guess what? I put my calendar up in my workplace and nobody has ever dealt with race, but people are coming by and asking me to talk about this calendar, asking questions, they're making comments. And I think we've got to do things like that. We're doing a project where we're trying to put markers at the places where this history needs to be elevated. So we've now put 4 slave markers in downtown Montgomery. We love talking about mid-19th century history in the South, right? But we don't like talking about slavery. So we're trying to mark it. We did this report on lynching. My goal is to put markers and monuments at every lynching site in America. I don't think you should be able to live in this country and go past the spaces where this horrific acts of violence and terrorism have taken place. There was no debate. We were going to have a memorial at the 9/11 site, and we should. But what about the other places where terrorism have gone unchallenged? And there's something about that that I think can push us to begin to deal with this. The other thing we have to do is express our concern for all of those who've been burdened by this. You know, I'm not trying to get to a different place just because I want to help African Americans. I want to help African Americans, absolutely. But I want to help everybody. There's a generation of people who are white in this country who were taught by their parents that they're better than other people because of their skin color. That's a kind of child abuse. And that we haven't helped them recover from that through our silence. And that's why we got to find our voice. I want to get to a place where we are free from the presumption of dangerousness and guilt, where we don't get all rattled when somebody says something about race, where we don't get conflicted because some person of color is in a space that we're not used to, but also where we don't have to worry all the time about this infection that we carry around with us. And that's got to be part of what we offer to people, is a new kind of freedom, a new kind of opportunity. We've been mimicking the habits of people, the behaviors of people who are not bigoted, but we actually haven't learned to be not bigoted. And I want us to stop the mimicry and actually learn to make steps forward.
Thank you.
Right over here.
Very much for coming.
Yes.
I had a question about mass
Identify
incarceration.
yourself.
Huh?
Identify yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name is Pulad.
Yeah.
I had a question about mass incarceration. Do you think there are reasons other than the drug war, racism, or a narrative of fear for this huge growth in the prison population? Maybe reasons that are more ambiguous or even legitimate, or at least complex? And if so, how should that be factored into how we approach it as a problem?
Yeah. You know, I actually think not really. I mean, the prison population in this country was very stable throughout the 20th century. I mean, we always hovered at the same level. And it really was a conscious decision in the 1970s, first by President Nixon, to regain political control. When we had all of these college students, you know, protesting on college campuses, the anti-war protests had disrupted the narrative. There were drugs in college life at levels that people hadn't seen before. And I think control was a political response to that, and criminal justice system was the medium that control was going to be influenced. But I think it was quite political. You know, the violent crime rate today is about where it was in the 1960s in most communities. So we didn't need 2.3 million people in jails and prisons to achieve the same kind of crime rate. So I do think it has been this misguided war on drugs. That's about 1 million people of the 2.3 that are in there. These kind of misguided three-strike mandatory sentencing contributes about another 500,000. And then I think we've got this excessive punishment. I do think economics has increasingly become a contributor to mass incarceration. And that's not about race and about the narrative per se. We now have private industries that have an economic model pushing them to maintain a high level of incarceration. So if I say, let's not put any more people in prison for simple possession of marijuana, and people say, yeah, that's a great idea, these private companies are going to send lobbyists to the legislature to make sure that bill doesn't get passed. Why? Not because they think that's a bad idea, but because they need to keep 2.3 million people in jails and prisons. They have an economic incentive to maintain high rates of incarceration. And we've never had to deal with a moneyed lobbying group that's about sustaining mass incarceration. And in some states, that's an enormous barrier to reform. And we're going to have to reorganize ourselves to deal with that kind of new threat, which I do think is part of it. I do think that that the narrative isn't just politicians. It's reinforced by the media. I mean, I'm astonished by how that's worked. I mean, you look at journalism today, and because of the competition of the internet, people become more desperate. And the model that seems to succeed is to keep the viewers afraid or keep them angry. That's what will keep them tuned in. Even the Weather Channel. I go to places, Sunday night, I turn on the Weather Channel and see what I'm supposed to be afraid of in Iowa. What am I supposed to be afraid of in California? Because there's going to be something, you know, dust bowls or dark clouds or gigantic raindrops or whatever. And they're talking in this way that is intended to make you stay tuned. Because if you don't stay tuned, something bad may come and get you. And it's just astonishing to me the way that narrative has really kind of infected the way we talk about a whole range of things. So I do think that's the biggest part of it. And what I want to do is to say, look, fear and anger are also the essential elements in oppression and abuse and genocide and all kinds of the horrible things that we see. But I think that the moneyed interest is the new challenge that we face that we haven't talked about in mass incarceration.
Right up here.
Hello, Brian.
Hi.
And thank you for your presentation. My name is Mong Neo, and I'm a doctoral student in the Graduate School of Education. My question is, what is your view on restrictions or limitations in the mandatory release, meaning that, early release with mandatory supervisions? So I wonder if the restrictions, requirements, and limitations, specifically for non-violent juveniles, does it play any role, in your opinion, in terms of having them coming back to jail or incarcerated?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think absolutely that our one of the ways in which we tried to get tough was to take away discretion from sentencers, and we use mandatory sentencing as a mechanism for achieving that, and I think it's been disastrous. I really do. I mean, the truth is that there is a narrative behind even very serious crimes. And if you don't understand the narrative, you're not going to get to the right outcome. I told you that story about that little boy who shot and killed his father, and most people would say that kid should not get life without parole, right? Because there's something behind that act. He is a kid who shot a man sleeping in a bed at point-blank range in the head. He committed murder. But if you think that that murder is like a lot of other murders, you're going to miss something that's going to lead you to injustice. So I do think mandatory sentencing has been a very big problem. It's also not really eliminated discretion. The mandatory sentencing just means that the discretion shifts from the judge to the prosecutor. And the prosecutor doesn't even have to articulate the reasons why it's exercising his or her discretion in that way. And in some jurisdictions, I think that's actually been even worse. I know that people distrust judges in some contexts, but I distrust elected politicians even more because they're making these decisions from a distance. So I would like to see us step back from that kind of mandatory sentencing. I'd like to see us kind of recover a commitment to doing justice, which is always going to require understanding the narrative behind the crime and the behavior. You get anybody close to a story. We've had a lot of success in our death penalty cases only because we're providing context for this behavior. And it's not me that's saying that they shouldn't get the death penalty. It's people who are believers of the death penalty in very rural southern communities that are incredibly conservative saying, no, we don't think that's appropriate there. And that's what you lose when you take away that discretion. And certainly for kids, I think in the context of juveniles, I mean, all children are going to change. So we can't create a punishment that's not changeable and apply it fairly to children. And I think that's the problem we're having with kids. It's also the problem we're having with the mentally ill. 50% of the people in jails and prisons are mentally ill. 20% are acutely mentally ill. And the fact that we can't consider that when we're imposing sentence, when we're dealing with what's a just outcome, I think really sets us up to be a society that is doing great disservice, great injustice to people with disabilities.
Right up here.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mia Knight. I'm from Ohio, and I'm a freshman in high school. And as you were hitting key points about race that I thought were highly intriguing and thought-provoking, my question is, do you believe in terms of race relations that conversations about race needs to be addressed to all races and ethnicities, not just what is highly popular between African Americans and Caucasians, but that it needs to be addressed, to the entire human race, essentially, in general?
Can I just first say how incredibly impressive it is that you are in here asking that brilliant question? Thank you for that. Yes, I absolutely think that. The calendar that we've developed, it's really about, and that's why I use this language, a narrative of racial difference, because when you get comfortable demonizing one group, as we did during the time of slavery toward people of African descent, it actually opens up your brain to do that again when it's convenient. And Native people in this country were burdened by a narrative of racial difference. We called them savages. And we did things that we justified because they weren't really trustworthy. They were violent, and we love to tell the stories about their extreme violence to make us comfortable with the systemic extreme violence we subjected them to. And that narrative continues to emerge. During the time of World War II, we put Japanese Americans in concentration camps. And we told a narrative about the threat that they posed to us. And there was a time in parts of the country where Catholics were deemed different in a way that allowed us to exploit them. And so yes, it's a kind of disease that if you don't deal with it, it will spread. Now, I do think, though, there is something fundamental about the challenge that African Americans face, because our history is rooted in enslavement, and it was coded and stratified and codified in ways that few things have been. And so it's going to take a special kind of intervention to deal with that. And while I think it's absolutely incumbent that we deal with it in any manifestation, we've got a new challenge now because we're dealing with people who are religious minorities, people from the Mideast, people who are Muslim are being menaced and threatened because of that status. And so we've got to be on guard to deal with all of it. And our calendar really tries to kind of tell that story by looking at these challenges, not just the challenges faced by African Americans, but by all kinds of people in our country.
Fred, we're just going to have time for 2 more questions, right here.
Thank you so much. My name is Anam Kotwavedi, and I'm a first-year Master in Public Policy student here. So as a former educator, I think about ways in which we can mobilize our youth around this issue of mass incarceration. And next weekend, we have about 40 youth coming here to attend the Black Policy Conference. What advice do you have for them on how to get involved in this issue and change the injustices regarding the criminal justice system?
That's a great question. I think in some ways it's the same thing, because I think sometimes young people don't think enough about doing the things that are uncomfortable, just like adults don't. And one of the ways that we're trying to push young people to kind of take this to heart is that they're oftentimes in environments where these dynamics of using power to bully other people, using power to condemn other people are really, really refined. And they have social features, they have cultural features, they have political features, and these kids are really seeing it. But a lot of times they're not connecting it to the activism that they want to engage in around issues like mass incarceration. So I really want them to kind of learn what it means to do uncomfortable things, even with their peers. It's a time of life where kind of standing up against your peers is sometimes really hard. And sometimes it's easier to stand up against adults when you're doing some of that activism, but it's also your peers. And if we can shape the thinking of our peers around these issues, that's when we begin to really see fundamental change. And that's my challenge to them. And there are some wonderful young people, because a lot of times they know the kids who don't believe that they're going to live past 21. They know the kids who feel traumatized by the violence that they experience. They know the kids that are at risk. And energizing them to intervene with those kids in meaningful and important ways is part of what I'm hoping we can stimulate with our young people. Yeah.
This will be the last question.
Hello, my name is Mary Gashaw. I'm a sophomore at the high school, there, Cambridge and Gelatin. And my question for you is that there's been a lot of discussion about reform not being enough for mass incarceration, and that there needs to be an abolition of prisoners. So my question is, what do you think about that, not having any more prisons in America?
Well, I think the concept is really intriguing. There's something attractive about doing something that is radical to create a different relationship to people who fall down. We do have people who are suffering and are struggling and are at risk, and I don't think it's acceptable to say we're just not going to do anything. But I was in Stockholm, Sweden, actually, just early last fall, and that's a society that they have prisons, but they're radically different kinds of institutions. They are really structured and designed to help people recover from whatever thing made them get pulled out of society. And you can even think about it. We tried it. We, for a long time, didn't call prisons prison. We called them correctional facilities. But that term has now been so corrupted by abuse and indifference and hostility to the people inside that it doesn't mean anything. But we could actually have a society that had correctional facilities that help people who were struggling and suffering, help people who were dealing with drug addiction, help people who were dealing with anger and violence and trauma. And I think that would be a wonderful thing. But if we mean by prisons places where we warehouse people and abuse them and beat them down and treat them inhumanely, then absolutely abolish them. But if we mean to create spaces where we do the things that are necessary to help people who are suffering and injured and broken and battered by the challenges that they face, then I support that. I don't think a society can thrive and grow and succeed if it's indifferent to people who are struggling, indifferent to people who are suffering, indifferent to people who have great challenges that need some societal help. There are these ideas out there that sometimes it's in helping other people that we understand who we are. And a society that doesn't choose to do that, I worry about. I really do. I think the great challenge that I see in my work oftentimes is the absence of compassion. It's the absence of mercy. It's the absence of hope. I mean, I just think anytime I see more hope, more compassion, more mercy, that's when I get really excited about what the human community can do. And I don't want to create a world where we use a label to say we're not going to do anything that does anything like that. I do want to see it change, its form, its character, its identity. And that's what really excites me about the kind of reform that we're trying to achieve.
Bryan Stevenson, it's been a great honor having you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.